Section 10.4a is about the quadratic formula. This is a formula that you can use to find the solution of a quadratic equation. Let me say that again. You can use this formula to find the solutions of a quadratic equation. Now I know some of you are going to be very angry at me because we could have used this solution on day one to find the roots instead of graphing. But I wanted you to have the experience of graphing so we could learn about a quadratic equations graph. And now that you hopefully understand that, we can find the solutions fairly easily. This formula uses the a, the b, and the c in a quadratic equation. You can find the solution, the x solution, by plugging the a in for the a's, the b in for the b's, and the c in for the c, and solving. So here's a quadratic equation that we have to solve using the quadratic formula. I left the formula up here so we could look at it. First thing to do is find out what the a, the b, and the c are. In this particular problem, my a is a 1. It's the coefficient of the x squared. My b is a negative 2. It's the coefficient of the x term. And my c is a negative 24. I'm going to use those numbers to plug in the quadratic formula. So we'll start by doing the opposite of b. b is a negative 2 plus or minus the square root of b squared. So I take my negative 2 and I square it, minus 4 times a, which is a 1, times c, which is a negative 24. And I put all of that over 2 times a, which is a 1. One thing to be sure you do is make sure you put all of that stuff on top over the 2. This line has to extend the whole way here. So I've seen some people cut it off short, so it looks like this, and that's just wrong. You have to divide everything. Now let's simplify. Negative negative 2 is a positive 2. 2 squared is a 4. This is a negative 4 times a negative 24 times 1 is a positive 96. And we'll take the square root of all that, and it's all over 2. Continuing to simplify, we'll do 4 plus 96 is 100, which actually is a nice number here because we know that the square root of 100 is a 10. So this becomes 2 plus and minus 10 over 2. Now what this really means is two solutions. You got 2 plus 10 over 2, and you have 2 minus 10 over 2. Well, 2 plus 10 is 12, and 12 divided by 2 is 6. 2 minus 10 is negative 8, and negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4. So using the quadratic formula, plugging the values in, I find out that the solutions of this quadratic equation are 6 and negative 4. Here's another example of solving this quadratic equation. One thing to note is it's not equal to 0, and I have to get it equal to 0 before I can tell what my a, b, and c are. So I'm going to subtract 6 from both sides. So my a here is 24, my b is negative 14, and my c is negative 6. Plugging those in, opposite of b, which is negative 14, plus or minus b squared is negative 14 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 24, times c, which is negative 6. All of that is the square root, and it's all over 2 times a, which is 24. So make sure when you plug these in, use parentheses to remind yourself of multiplication. Simplifying now, negative times negative is a positive. Negative 14 squared is 196. Now this part, be careful, this is a negative 4, and that's how you should treat this. A negative 4 times a 24 times a negative 6. So you're multiplying those three numbers. Two negatives means it's going to be a plus, and that gives me a 576. And that's all over 2 times 24, which is 48. 196 plus 576 is 772. So now we have our first example where we just get a crazy number, and this is definitely a calculator problem. What this really means is 14 plus the square root of 772 divided by 48, and 14 minus the square root of 772 divided by 48. If you plug this into a calculator and then you round it to the nearest tenth, you're going to get a 0.9. And if you plug this into a calculator and you round to the nearest tenth, you're going to get a negative 0.3. So I'll write my answer as negative 0.3 and 0.9. You need to know how to type these values into your own calculator to get this decimal, and if you need help, come and see me and I will help you. Here's another example of solving using the quadratic formula. I would suggest pausing the video and trying this one on your own, and I'll try to put most of my work up here quickly and then walk you through it. Here's the work. I plugged in a 3 for A, a 5 for the B, and an 11 for the C. Plug it into the formula. 5 squared gave me a 25, and 4 times 3 times 11 was a 132 with a minus. When you subtract, you get negative square root of 107. Now, if you try to put that in your calculator, you probably got an error, and you may have gotten frustrated, but don't worry about that. You cannot take the square root of a negative. So it turns out that if you ever have a negative answer underneath the square root, you're going to have no solution to the problem. And that should make sense because we did talk about when we graphed quadratic functions, there is a possibility of having a parabola that looks like this, where it never touches the x-axis. It is possible when using the quadratic formula for you to get a no solution. That means there is no solution to this quadratic equation. Here we have a summary of solving quadratic equations. This really gives the different methods that we've learned, when you could use them, and when might be the best time to use a certain method. Graphing is something that you could always use. It's not exact. I would only graph to estimate solutions. You're probably going to want to leave graphing alone and not use it unless I ask you to. The second method of solving quadratics is by factoring. This is great when the constant term is 0 or when the factors are real easy, when it's real simple for you to factor or to use a perfect square trinomial or something. Completing the square is another method you can use. It only works when you have a quadratic equation in this form where b is even. That's the best. But the one that always will work is the quadratic formula. A lot of times it's the easiest. You plug the numbers in, you use a calculator, and it gives it. It'll always give you accurate solutions. So for me, unless I tell you otherwise, feel free to use the quadratic formula to find the roots of a quadratic equation.